Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Why Do ITSM Projects Fail? A look at common implementation pitfalls and how to avoid them. This is a presentation by SunView Software in association with Pink Elephant. My name is Jamie Spector, and I'm the Product Marketing Manager here at SunView Software, and I'll be your host for this presentation. And for today's main event speaker, it's Mr. George Spalding. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with Mr. Spalding, but for the uninformed, he is the Executive Vice President at Pink Elephant, and is regarded as one of the world's most insightful and engaging ITSM industry experts, executive management consultants, and trainers. He holds many certifications in mastery of ITIL, business relationship management, organizational change, and more. He is also the co-author of the ITIL version 3 Continual Service Improvement Core Volume and has contributed to countless pieces of editorial content, white papers. He's been a sought-after keynote speaker, a radio host. The list just goes on and on. George, we're honored to have you here with us this afternoon.
Thanks, Jamie. Appreciate it.
So before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping notes. This webinar will be available shortly after its conclusion. Share this webinar and follow SunView Software for more information on ITSM, implementation, and ITIL best practices. And we'll still have some time for questions at the end here, but if you have anything to add, feel free to send additional questions or comments to our SunView Marketing email address, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So let's take a quick look at the agenda. So the first line item is Mr. Spalding's presentation, of course, followed by a quick summary and recap, and then we'll end the presentation with a brief Q&A to get some of your questions answered. So our goal today is to address some of the most common issues IT professionals deal with during implementation, along with some tips on how to avoid them in the first place. So one last item to take care of before we get started here. I just wanted to quickly share a supplementary ebook we have titled Understanding the Hidden Costs of ITSM. So if you're interested in hearing more on how you can save on some of those unforeseen costs of an ITSM solution, including things like implementation, I encourage you to take a look. Just click the call out button that should appear on your video player, and you should be able to download it right from there. And so without further ado, I'm going to toss it over to Mr. Spalding for his presentation, Why Do ITSM Projects Fail? A look at common implementation pitfalls and how to avoid them. Take it away, George.
So let's get going. Let's get started. So the basic title of this is Why Do ITSM Projects Fail? Really, in many ways, what we're really talking about is why do IT projects fail? Are there specific things with an ITSM project that makes it a bit different? Yes, there are, and we'll talk about those once we set the context for IT projects and how well they seem to be doing over the last, believe it or not, 20 years. So why do IT projects fail? So we're going to talk in detail about the fact that for the most part, projects are simply too big. They take too long. We have existing project management methodologies out there that may or may not help us. PMs are not necessarily grasping or embracing the new way to do things, but we'll talk a little more about that. Too much too soon. People like organizations, in fact, it's almost the other way, have an appetite for change. And not everyone has the same appetite for food, and not everybody likes the same things to eat, and therefore not everybody has the same appetite for change. And in many cases, the projects that we're doing, especially on the ITSM side, are actually transformational projects. It's more than just throwing in a piece of software or updating a piece of software or adding a process here and a process there. It's more than that. And that transformation can be something that people, especially what I've found, leaders, aren't taking into account as they put forth an ITSM project. There doesn't seem to be a large recognition of culture when we do these things. What I mean by that is, and we'll talk more, is that culture's there. You already have one. Every organization has a culture. They've got it right now. And sometimes when we transform people or attempt to transform them or attempt to put in a new tool with new processes and new this and new that, the key word being new, we even use the words, we'll take them out of their comfort zone. Well, when you take somebody out of their comfort zone, they are going to, without really knowing it, they're going to fight to get back into that comfort zone. We're going to talk more about that. And the last key point I want to talk about here is tools and automation. Because what I see out there, and it's still true today in 2018, which is kind of surprising really, is that there are organizations that believe that by buying a specific tool, all their problems will be solved. Everything's perfect. We'll just buy the tool, we'll use the standard install right out of the box, and it will be perfect. And not just the tool will be perfect, but everything will be perfect. All of our pain points will simply go away because we bought the tool and the tool's great and everything's going to be fine. On the other side of this, then they may, and this is, I wish it was funny, but it's not funny. They may buy the tool, install the tool. Now they've got it in, and now they're going to spend the next 6 to 12 months making the tool they just bought, customizing it, changing the code to look just like the tool they just got rid of, because that's what they know and that's what they like and that's what they're comfortable with. So instead of that, shouldn't they just configure it? Because most of these modern tools are very easily and ultimately configurable without changing the code and without rewriting the tool. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about for the next half hour or so. All right, too big, too long projects. So historically, there's an organization out there called the Standish Group, and they have been measuring the success of IT projects for over 20 years. Success rate of IT projects for over 20 years. And the criteria for success becomes, of course, part of this conversation. And the criteria is what you would think it is. The project was on time, was on budget, and was on value. What does that mean? It means that the project had a charter and had certainly a mission and had specific deliverables that were supposed to do X, Y, Z for whoever was the recipient of the project. And so if you count only those three criteria as successful, then basically IT projects are running and it's pretty consistent over the 20 years. It's not like we've gotten worse or we've gotten better. We're just running flat at 35% successful. At 65% failed based on something, based on the fact that its time slipped, based on the fact that it ran over budget, or based on the fact that when the project was done and was delivering whatever it was supposed to deliver, it wasn't the value proposition which had caused us to do the project in the beginning wasn't there at the end. It wasn't, as I didn't deliver on the value it was supposed to. So one of the problems here is that we have over the years, and I'm sure that everyone who's listening to this has done this or been part of the project that ate Cleveland. Some gigantic project that was millions of dollars and took 9 to 12 to 18 months or longer and was considered at the end okay. I've seen and even been a very peripheral part of projects where They were $20 million in 2 years into the project, and then they said, no, we're scrapping it. They just stopped. So what's the point? Well, the point is simple. The Standish Group really doesn't make a lot of recommendations. They just mostly track what's going on. By the way, they added one more criteria just to see whether it would help. And that criteria, the fourth criteria, was, is the customer happy with what they got? And when they added that criteria, then it got worse. Then the success rate was actually about 29%. So I'm not trying to depress people. What I'm trying to tell you is that the one recommendation they had coming out of this was projects should be smaller. Make the project smaller. I mean, a lot smaller. No more 9-month, 12-month, 18-month, 2-year. No. Smaller projects. Smaller projects. Now, I'm specifically talking about IT projects, and as you well know, there are two major, in some ways competing, but not completely, competing project management methods. The waterfall method versus agile project management. Certainly in the concept of developing software, there is no question that agile is the preferred method to develop software. It, by definition, is iterative, so it encourages smaller and smaller and smaller chunks. Smaller chunks. So that, as opposed to waterfall, which by its definition, and first of all, by the way, waterfall's been around for well over 50 years. And we've been using it to develop software for well over 50 years. And it was created back way back, even long before we were ever developing software. It was actually created as a way to develop products. How should we develop a product like a toaster or an airplane? How should we do that? Well, we should spend a lot of time and a lot of money up front getting all of the requirements and making sure that we've got every single thing that we and anyone else can think of locked down, and we know exactly what we want to do. And then we take those requirements and we lock them, and we say, okay, from that part, we're going to design it, then we're going to build the design, then we're going to test the build, and then we're going to finally implement the corrected and tested whatever it is. And waterfall is still the right method for building a jet airplane. I don't really want to ride around in an agile built jet airplane, and I'm not sure I have any interest in living in an agile built house or an agilely built office building. No, I don't want that. But in terms of building software and creating software, there's really no question. Agile is the way to go. So smaller is better. So what about the big project? What about the big 18-month project? What do? Break it into pieces. Smaller and smaller pieces. Because what happens is that human beings, I like this quote, human beings know exactly what they don't want as soon as they see it. Now, that means that in the Agile world, especially Scrum, we're going to give them something to look at every 2 to 4 weeks. And they can then change the scope, which we've never, and change the requirements. And that's fine. We can just keep adjusting and adjusting and adjusting. Well, but we won't ever be done. Well, maybe we'll be done sooner. Maybe we'll get to the point where they look at it and say, oh, I know we're technically not done, but this is exactly what I think we need, so stop. So you can actually be done sooner in the Agile world than in the waterfall world. But the one thing you're absolutely certain of in the Agile world is that the customer's going to get what they want. Okay, so this is key, because why aren't we on time? Why aren't we on budget? And why aren't we on value? in the historical look at projects? Well, usually we're looking at waterfall projects. And because they go on so long, it's inevitable that we have what we call scope creep. So it's inevitable that people add to the project along the way, which therefore makes it slip, raises the money, and doesn't give people the value they wanted. So they keep adding things along the way. They do scope creep. And why doesn't that happen in Agile? Well, it's really pretty simple, because there isn't enough time. It's so short we get to the end of the sprint. And then they're welcome to add to the scope. They're welcome to change things. We're not fighting it. We're welcoming it. But during the sprint, during the iteration, do we allow them to change things? No, we don't. And it's not an issue because it's so fast and it's so small. So that's why, depending on the kind of project and depending on what we're building, but if it involves building software, Agile's pretty much the way to go. And in almost any way we can do it, if we can break it into smaller and smaller chunks, we're going to be a lot better off. We're going to have more success. Look at an ITSM project. Don't we basically, we install the system, and maybe we install certain modules, and then we then say, okay, we're going to just do incident management, or we're going to just do change management. Those might have a better chance of working than if we say, oh, well, look at all the different supported processes in this particular tool. We are going to do them all at once. I firmly believe that's a huge mistake. Too much too soon. Too often, these projects that we put in, including ITSM projects, in some ways especially ITSM projects, are changing processes. They are changing the way people work. They're giving them a new tool, but mostly it's the way they work that's changing. And people simply, adult people, don't like change very much. So in a nutshell, what is it that we're changing? We're doing organizational change. We are doing transformation. How do you do that? How do you do organizational change? Really, this is just a little 30-minute webinar. I'm going to tell you, organizational change in 5 minutes. Here it is. First, the leader has to come up with a vision. And not just some pie in the sky, rosy, la-di-da vision. I am talking about, I need to be able to see it, touch it, feel it, taste it, smell it, live it. In fact, the best way I've ever seen of describing vision is when you describe it, you then have, it's almost like a skit or a play. You do a day in the life of the way it is now, and a day in the life of how it's going to be with actual people, the workers who are going to do it. In the skit, we show them how their life is going to change. We show them what's in it for them. Okay, second step, urgency. Because everyone's going to have the same question. Okay, yeah, looks good, yeah. But why do we have to do it now? Why now? Why can't we just wait? Can we put this off a year? Why now? And the answer to this is key, because first of all, the answer has to be, well, we can't wait. We have to do it now. Why? Now, there's two ways to go about this, and I've seen leaders do it both ways, and trust me, there's a right way and a wrong way. The wrong way is for the leader to say, well, I've been thinking about it, and I have a better strategy than the way we're currently doing it, and the way we're currently doing it really is awful. It sucks. The way we're doing it now sucks. What that leader is forgetting, that the audience that he or she is talking to are the people who just spent 10 or 15 years staying late, coming in on weekends, sweating bullets, building the status quo. Therefore, you are dissing them, the very people you want to get on board, the very people you want to come with you, you are dissing them by talking about how terrible our current way of doing things is. What's the right way then? The way we're doing it now has worked for us for years. There is no question about that. And I want to tell you how much I appreciate all of the efforts that you all have put into getting us where we are. But what got us here isn't going to get us there. The world has changed. Things are different. Expectations are different. Customer expectations are dramatically different. We have to change with the times, or we won't be here to talk about it. That's why we have to change, and that's why we have to do it now. Number 3, step 3. There has to be a plan. And when I say plan, I'm not saying, well, we're going to send you all to training and then that'll be just fine. No, that's not it. The plan has to be very specific and very clear, and it's got to be very clear for each individual. And it's got to be step by step by step. You do this first step, get to the end of the first step. Congratulations. We'll go to the second step. What about the timing? Will everybody go at the same speed? No, that's an unrealistic expectation for everybody to go at the same speed. Some will be super fast, and they're there. Some will not be fast. It may or may not have something to do with age. You'd be amazed that in this transformational cultural discussion that we're going to have, it's not always the old people like me who are stuck in their way of doing things, but rather that they've been through transformations. The older people have been through corporate transformations. They've been through it and they've come out on the other side and they survived. And in some cases it was better. In some cases probably wasn't. But they've seen it, been there, done that, bought the t-shirt. The young people have not. They got hired under a set of rules that they thought, believe it or not, this is their own naivete, but they thought that that set of rules was going to stay in force forever. That this was the same game and the rules would stay the same. They didn't. It never occurred to them that someone could just literally say, hey, that was fun. Now we're going to do a different game. Well, I thought we were playing basketball. Nope, not doing basketball anymore. Now we're doing soccer. Different game. Well, but I'm really good at basketball. Yeah, but we're not playing that anymore. And they never really, that never came into their conscious mind that that was what could happen. And that in many cases in transformation, that's exactly what does happen. So there are right ways and wrong ways. First of all, a recognition that that this isn't about putting in a piece of software. This isn't about even clarifying new processes, though that's a good part of it. But we're in this business here to change people because we're going to change the way they work. Otherwise, why would we be buying a tool? Why would we be redesigning processes? We wouldn't if we weren't going to actually change the way people work. Culture. A little bit about what I was talking about before. Strategy versus culture. People coming in saying, I got the new way is not necessarily a good thing. People do have, we all have. I do, you do, Jamie does. We all have comfort zones. Places where we are comfortable. We know how to do it, don't have to think much about it, all of those types of things. So for better or worse, we basically have a comfort zone. And what I find sometimes is that leaders who don't quite get this will come in with their strategy and talk about how wonderful the strategy is. It may, don't get me wrong, maybe it is. Maybe it's a wonderful strategy. But I loved this Peter Drucker quote. It's more than 50 years old. And it basically says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. No strategy will survive a cultural issue. The culture is what we're about. is where we already are. Every business, every company, every family has a culture. We all know it. Sometimes we talk about it. Sometimes we don't. Whether it's in the business, we have elephants in the living room, or whether it's in your home life, you have elephants in the living room. There's a culture. There are things we talk about and things we don't talk about. And the more transparent we are, probably the healthier we are. But as people come in and talk about these kinds of changes, they often will say the words, I'm going to change the culture. And that is what they want to do. That's absolutely what they want to do. And there's a lot of conversations out there right now in terms of lean and agile and DevOps. And DevOps certainly is a dramatic change in culture. But the basic concept of this is, if you walk in saying, let's change the culture, it probably won't work. But because you don't understand that there's a fundamental step toward changing the culture. And that's something you can control, because you can incent it or disincent it. You can demand that people show up for meetings. You can do all sorts of things. You can change behavior. You can change the way people behave. You can change what they have to do in order to succeed. You can change the reporting structures. You can change the reward mechanisms. You can change those things. And you can therefore change their behavior, which will always follow the money. And maybe it'll follow what's the right thing to do and what makes it easier for me. That's behavior. And after a while of that changed behavior, you'll discover that it becomes part of the culture, that that's really what it's about. And suddenly we have changed the culture, but we did it through changing little teeny steps, little teeny improvements, etc., in behavior. And that's how we managed to change the culture. I mean, one phrase in the DevOps world is, so the traditional good culture would be, I'm a manager and I have an open door policy, which means I'm in my office, just come in. Well, in the DevOps world, that's considered bad because you're sitting in the office. Get out of the office. Go down and do what Lean calls the Gemba walk. Go to the Gemba. Go to the place where work happens. Don't have an open door policy. Go down and talk to the people who are doing the work. See what they do. Ask questions. Our last major topic is tools and automation. And because, of course, SunView and Change Gear is a tool, obviously that's important. But so I keep hearing about automation. I hear about it in this world of DevOps, and there's about 1 million tools in DevOps, and we're supposed to just automate everything. And of course, that's the whole idea. We just automate everything. It's got only good associated with automation. Well, first of all, let's talk about so why do we automate? We automate because it will save you money, because machines and software and computers do things a lot faster, so it's faster. It is consistent, so it's always doing it the same way. It's always the same way. It doesn't have human error issues. It doesn't. Humans are prone to error in general. But what is it that we actually automate? For the most part, when we look at automation, we are automating processes. So we're actually taking an existing process or piece of a process, and we're going to automate that process. Well, surprise, surprise, in order to do that, the process has to be mature. I'm not going to get into all the levels of maturity, et cetera, but the process has to be what we call level 3, which is formalized, documented, repeatable, predictable, measurable, monitorable, auditable, and capable of producing data to improve itself. The process has to already be at that phase in order really to automate it. So I get people saying, well, we'll just automate it right out of the box. Well, that's not impossible. But what it forces you to do is to say, we don't care what our process is. Whatever the vendor has shipped as the process, that's what we'll use. And that usually isn't the way that most organizations work. It can. You can take it right out of the box and shove it in and say, okay, look, incident management, perfect. We'll just do it their way. But that's not usually the way it works. Usually the way is, well, we already have a process and we kind of like it to look that way, but the more you follow the way the vendor has it, then probably it's going to go in faster, it's going to be easier, it's going to be what I've seen out there, it's going to be much quicker to value, much faster to value. Because that's really, you spend money on these tools, you want them to be valuable to you. Should I customize or should I configure? I think I already answered that, but I'm going to answer it again. You should configure. Well, but what you're saying I could customize? No. Let me be clear. Don't customize. Don't change the code. It will slow things down in terms of upgrades and fixes from the vendor community. It will basically, what you're saying is you know better than the software vendor that you just picked after shopping around. So you shopped around and then you picked a specific vendor because you liked their tool, and then now you want to change it. Now you want it to look like the way you used to do it. No, this is a change. This is a transformation. This is something new, and that's okay. We just need to be sure that configuring, which can change a lot. Well, I'm just amazed at how much the vendor community has adopted this basic philosophy of don't customize, configure. And they've made it possible to configure what the screen looks like, what fields talk to other fields, what fields are visible, what fields aren't. All of that becomes a configurable element on the screens and in the interaction of the data. So the vendors are doing a great job. Don't ruin it as a customer by spending the money, then spending more money to change the vendor code so it looks like something that you had before, which you didn't like, so you're buying a new tool. I cannot tell you how crazy it is. It's out there. Okay, well, you're pretty clear as to how I feel. That's pretty much my section on this, Jamie.
Thanks, George. That was excellent. So before we get to the Q&A, I just want to let you know if you have any deeper questions, comments, or personal stories regarding anything you've seen in this webinar, we encourage you to reach out directly and send an email over to myself or Mr. Spalding using the addresses you see above on your screen. Okay, let's get to the Q&A. So I've got this first question coming in here. What is the number one complaint, George, that you hear from people who have struggled during the implementation process?
We should have slowed down. What I mean by that is that it gets back to the too much. They get excited. They buy the tool, and they get excited about all the different processes that are able to be automated, able to run in the tool, able to be integrated. But the number one comment I hear from them is, I should have slowed down. I should have focused on incident or change, and then come back around. And they do this because often leadership has given them 6 months to get it all done, and then we're moving on to something else. The other part about this is that if you focus on incident management, let's just use that as a sample. You focus on incident management, you've got a really good process, you like it, you get it in, the tool's good, everything's doing well. Okay, then you decide to focus on change management. You come in, you do that. Well, you now have to go back and look at incident management again for a couple of reasons. One is because you probably have integration points now that you aren't being used because you didn't have anything to integrate with before. And secondly, because people left to their own devices, depending on how well they're watched and how well they're incented, will start to basically go back to the comfort zone and go back to the old process. So basically, if you slow down a little bit in terms of the implementation, not the software implementation, but actually rolling it out, that I think is the biggest comment that I've heard.
Okay. Next question. In your experience, how has the implementation process changed over the past few years? Is it becoming more or less complex for IT organizations?
I think it's less. And it's changed by the fact that the vendor community has done a great job of figuring out both what ITIL is saying, that because that tends to be the one thing they can hang their hat on, which basically says, okay, the only one that kind of makes sense out there is ITIL, so we'll hang our hat on that one. So they're very clear on that. ITIL's very clear on the way it thinks, and therefore they're basically creating things that the organization, creating processes and modules that the client organizations are really pleased with and have less need to change, less need to customize. And the vendor community has made things more configurable. So I actually believe that the implementation is much, much less complex than it used to be. In the old days, there were definitely tools out there that were almost a development environment as opposed to a tool, where basically you bought the tool and then you spent the next 6 to 12 months developing using that tool as your basis.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. Here we go. What are some quick recommendations, George, that you'd give to an IT organization preparing for a new implementation project?
Basically, I guess I would really focus, because when we talk about a new implementation project, we mean that they bought a tool, they've acquired a tool. In your case, of course, they've gone with Change Gear from SunView, excellent tool. But they've done that, so now they tend to be focused on the tool. They focus on the implementation, focused on the software. I want them to focus on the processes that the tool is automating, that the tool is assisting in, that the tool is helping, all of those things. I want them to focus on the processes and the integration between those processes, and therefore how can they get to value faster using the tool and using all the strengths of the tool. How do they get, what's the main value, what's the payoff of incident management? People are back up and running. What's the payoff of change management? Successful changes, things don't break. And we know about every change. What's the payoff from problem management? We don't have repeat incidents. Things don't come back around. Those are the kinds of things. So when we look at the payoff of why we want those different modules and why we want those different processes, I believe that people need to focus on the process first. They've already made the choice of the tool, and they need to focus on the process, and then how those two things, how the tool and the processes work together, that's what they're looking at. That's the major path, if you will, to value that they can use.
All right, I think we're about ready to wrap things up here. So I just want to give a big thanks to everyone for watching the webinar with us this afternoon. And also I want to give a big thanks to Mr. Spalding for his presentation. George, it's always a pleasure.
Thanks, Jamie.
All right, have a great rest of your day, everyone.